All right, everybody, we'll give you a second to log in here as normal. Feel free to ask typed questions in the Twitch chat or the Discord. If you don't have the Discord, it means you're not a student, so it's fine. All right, and today, what are we doing? We are doing St. Augustine's City of God. That is the plan for today, and we're going to do kind of his historical theory. Let me turn on my laser pointer. We're going to do his historical theory, his theology, his philosophy. So that's today. Will we finish it today? We might get a little behind, but I think we'll get most of the way there. It should be fine. All right. Let's jump on in. Okay, so I'm going to give us a long overview of St. Augustine before we get into, and this is a picture of him, by the way. There's lots of pictures of him. He's a big saint. But we're going to get into the basics of his thought. I'm going to give you kind of the overview like we do with Taoism and Buddhism. And then we're going to get into the elaborate detail, and then we'll come back up and wrap it all up at the end. Alright, so we already did who he was last class. So if you missed that, go watch the end of the last stream. You can see how we did him, like specifically. Yeah, like who was he, where did he live, what was his time period. That was all last class. This class is the philosophical and details of what he believed. So, okay. So first one, theology. What is basic theology? Well, there's some real theories we have to understand here to kind of get into it. And they're distinctly Christian ones, but they're good to understand if you want to understand a Christian worldview. And considering we still live in a at least semi-Christian civilization, this is probably good to understand. So the first two ideas he spends a lot of time on is predestination and providence. And this first one is actually why a lot of modern Catholics prefer St. Thomas Aquinas over him. So predestination, what does this mean? Well, destiny just means you kind of know it's going to happen. But predestined means before something happens, it's known to happen. Now, who knows? Well, for St. Augustine, it's God. And for a Christian, this is the biblically orthodox position. So basically, if God created everything, and God is everything, like God knows everything and made everything, and is outside of time, which we'll get to in a minute, but we'll do that one next class. But if God's created everything is outside of time and is all-knowing, then he has to know all the choices we're going to make, because he knows everything. So that's what predestination means. God knows everything that's going to happen. Now, how does this interact with free will? We'll get into it, I promise. There is free will, too, in Christian belief. So how that interfaces, we'll get into how that interacts. Providence, this is a very interesting one. The simple definition of providence is God's plan for the universe. If you ever heard a Christian say, like, all things work together for good, for those who love God and go according to his commandments. That's part of providence, but providence is also if God created a system. This is, again, St. Augustine, but Augustine basically really got deep into providence in the idea that if God made the whole system, then there has to be rules from the system that we can understand, and then the working out of those rules that God made is providence. And I'll explain how that works in the bit. So these are two key theological ideas for St. Augustine, and they're a big part of City of God, and especially this one, when we get into time and confessions. All right. Also, at the same time, is the prominence of free will in his theory. Now, how could God know everything and we have free will? Well, St. Augustine would say, well, Catholics and probably a lot of Protestants too, actually, would call this a mystery. What that means is God can know everything that's going to happen, but God also has the power to give us will. Now, how does that work exactly? The shrugging classic answer is it's a mystery, right? But God has that power to both let us make choices and know the choice we're going to make. Welcome to the idea. And this one's important too if you have any kind of moral, if a religious choice or moral choice matters, you kind of have to have free will. Otherwise, why does it matter? All right. Now, metaphysics. This is above physics, right? So the explanation of how the system works. He has a lot of theories on the nature of God and time. I'm not going to get into those too much today, but basically the theory of time that all Christians and a lot of moderns use is Augustinian. How? Well, that's what that e-reserve reading we're doing for next time is about. If you haven't read it yet, the chapter, book 11 of Confessions, that's what we're doing next class. That'll get into that. He's also hugely influential in political thought. Now, how? Well, in City of God, he's the guy. He's the first to kind of advocate this idea for it already exists separation between the city of heaven and the city of man. And if you read Russell, which you probably did, Russell points out it's where we get the kind of the early idea of separation of church and state. But more importantly, it's the idea that the church is not an apparatus of the state. Does that make sense? Russell, who's an atheist, prefers the state not having any influence from the church. But Augustine intends it to be the fact that there's this sphere, like a sphere of heaven, and there's a sphere of like man or like normal life, and they are separate. So why was this dynamic? In the Roman and the Greek and the Persian and the Babylonian times, that religion are like an apparatus of the state. And the fact that this isn't a thing is a new dynamic thing that was distinctly Christian. And if you remember, we talked about Buddhism, and we talked about Confucianism and Taoism. All of those were state apparatus at some point. Okay. Also, when it comes to like political theory, talking about moral and practical and real consequences of how our actions work. So we're talking about free will and theology, right? That's like philosophical theory. But then he spends a bunch of his book applying how do ethical ideas work in the consequences of our actions in political, and if politics is just drama, right? It's just people interacting with each other. So how the consequences of actions work in like real political life. And a lot of this book is actually a history book, City of God. He's also a moral philosopher. This is interesting. So City of God, we'll get into it, but he basically has a bifurcation. There's a City of God, which is the Christian, non-physical, it's the city of godly believers, and then you have the city of man. And he points out there's different moral codes for each one. This is interesting. So he does not cross his streams, like, he doesn't think that the religious would necessarily be so involved, but he also just has a different moral code for each system. So kind of in a moral setting, he has different expectations for basically Christians and non-Christians. But this has knock-on effects going forward into history, which we'll get into. Now, this one's a little interesting for modern people, but he points out that the city of man, which is like the secular city, if to use a modern term, there's a word he used, that the Greek word we get secular from. Man, there's some fun stuff happening. Okay, so the city of man is, that's a chat comment. So basically, the city of man can still have virtue and truth. Now, how does this work? Well, for Augustine, he ties it back to providence. Basically, there is true, aka effective, aka correct ways to live. And the city of man, the secular world, can have those traits. However, they're not as good as the city of God, full virtues. But he basically, if you've ever heard the word virtuous pagan, that's kind of an Augustinian idea. But it's the idea that these godly virtues for a Christian, especially for St. Augustine, are built into reality. And then, because they're built into reality, then these kind of fights can start to happen. These kind of capitulations can happen. So a non-Christian can intuit truths about reality without being a Christian. So this is, again, an interesting theory of how history works, and we'll get into this too as we go. Any questions so far that aren't chat drama? And if you don't know why I'm saying that, read the Twitch chat. Okay, I see one person typing a question. We'll give it a second. You can type it, and I'll let the next picture show up. Yeah. Because it's a beautiful picture. So somebody asked, so one person's goal would be to get to the city of heaven. Well, you could say the Christian's goal, in an Augustinian point of view, is once a Christian's, we'll get into the details, but like, yes, but the city of Augustine has a very classic view of theology. So what that means is the city of heaven isn't a future thing, it's a now thing. So the city of heaven is a current distinction, not a future distinction. So by being kind of following God's law and the rules of God, they're in the city of God now, or city of heaven now. So it's a current state, not a future state. I mean, it is a future state too, right? But it's a now thing. So right now there's a city of heaven and a city of man in Augustinian theory. And we'll get into what all that theory is. For now, I just want you to know it exists. That's a good question. All right, so let's get into the motivation. Why does this book exist? And this picture is one of the indicators. If it looks kind of chaotic and bad, we'll talk about why. Well, it's this. It's the sack of Rome. So, if you don't know where Rome is, it's a big city in Italy. It was the capital of the world for 1,000 years. And by the world, I mean the European world. But still, it was the capital of Rome, the Roman Empire, for 1,000 years. But in 410, Rome got sacked. Now, sacked doesn't mean put in a bag or fired. It means literally this picture. Like, look at this. The city gets burned, barbarians invade, they steal all the wealth, they enslave the people, they rape the women, etc. Horrifyingly bad. So an empire that had been ruling the world for 900 years had its capital burned and sacked by barbarians. And when I say barbarian, you're like, oh my god, Professor, what does that mean? They're literally Germanic barbarians who basically got pissed off by the empire and then burned their capital to the ground. So this is the sack of Rome, is why he wrote this book. Well, why? Well, basically, at this time, Roman Empire was officially Christian, but you could say it was probably like 60-40. About 40% of the Roman Empire was still pagans. So they believed in Zeus and Hera and all the traditional gods. And the pagans blamed the conversion of the empire on Christianity for the fall of Rome. So they basically blamed, they shifted all the problems of Rome onto Christianity. Like, if only we would have our old gods and follow the old ways, Rome never would have been sacked. So it's basically a spiritual explanation for a physical event. So the goal of this book is a defense of Christianity from pagan attacks, practical attacks. These are like political attacks. They're theological and political attacks, right? So Christianity is directly to blame for the fall of the Rome the city, and also the decline of the empire. Now, the broad organization of this book, the first half is almost exclusively historical argumentation of refuting this point here. The basically the pagans blaming the empire's falling on Christianity. So St. Augustine makes a very good, I would call it the first 10 books, they're chapters, but they're called books. He makes a historical defense and he's a classically trained Roman, right? So he uses the Roman canon to prove that there's not a causal connection between the fall of Rome and Christianity. The second half of the book is theology and the city of God theory, but they're all connected, because he's basically defending Christianity, then explaining what system is it. Because many of his readers probably weren't Christian, right? And also Christians are trying to understand, like, okay, but then how do we make a Christian system? What does it mean to be a Christian in a non-Christian system? How do we live in this time when our capital is literally burned to the ground? So these kind of books make a lot of sense, actually, in our time, right? Not a lot of people are dying, but you can see that little bit more tension, right? Like, things are getting a bit worse. So this kind of fact that, I don't know, we can see a little bit of that chaos. These kind of questions suddenly become a lot more important. All right. Now, some of the underpinnings of the book, we'll call them sub-thesis. One of the big sub-thesis in this book, which Russell also found very interesting, is explaining why bad things happen, especially if the Christians are right. But remember, we talked about Buddhism and Taoism too, right? Every major religion has to deal with why do we suffer, what is the source of suffering. So Augustine has to answer what is the reason for bad things happening to good people. Now, so the big two in the beginning of the book, the big questions, that's what I mean by the big two. The big two questions he answers here, firstly, is why was Rome sacked? And why could holy people have physical bad things happen to them? Because these are good questions, right? It doesn't matter if you're a Christian or not, but like in this time it was Christians asking, like, how could a Christian during the sack of Rome be raped, like a virgin nun? Like, how could that happen? What's the moral responsibility? You know, what's these reasons? So this is interesting. So Augustine's kind of solution of this, and this is where we get a lot of modern religious dogma, actually. This is a quote from Russell, but I'll explain it with Augustine, St. Augustine. So the focus on lust and the interplay with the independence of the will. So this is where we kind of get, how can I say, why bad things happen, and then what is our responsibility morally when bad things happen to us. And this is from St. Augustine's point of view. So firstly, he points this out. He points out that bad things happen in reality because free will exists. Now, why does he make this point? Well, I explained the original sin idea for Christians, but there's still this idea that, like, in a Christian historical view, basically, a Christian anthropology, choice is necessary, because every step along the way, I don't know, somebody asked, did I hear dogma? I mean, if by dogma you mean the simple definition, which is, how can I say it? Dogma would mean the basic teachings of an organization, then yes, but I've also taught Buddhist and Taoist dogma, to be fair to the Christians. So, okay, so let's get back on topic. Bad things happen because free will exists. So Christians believe bad happens because there's freedom to be evil too, right? Because if you only have one choice, this is from St. Augustine's point of view in City of God, but if you only had one choice, you're not making a good choice. You're just making the only choice you have. So to have a good, meaningful choice, so for a Christian to be choosing God, right? To choose God, you have to have the evil choice. So therefore, bad things happen because evil is an acceptable choice. This is the first answer that he has. Now the second answer, do I have it on the next slide? Hold on, I gotta check now. Where are my PowerPoints? Here we go. Let's see. Did I delete it? I did delete it. Weird. Okay, so the second point I want to make here, which isn't on the slide, is when I say the lust part, what this means is, I mentioned before that, and Russell spends a lot of time capitulating this. Like, the Christian community was asking, like, what happened to a lot of the women who got raped? Because when a city gets sacked, men die. A lot of the time, most of the men are killed, and women get raped and become slaves. That's just world history, folks. So it's like, but did that person who get raped sin? Because that's a real question. Like, where's the moral responsibility? And Augustine's answer is I'll say it's very Christian, but it's also very morally astute. He basically makes the point that to sin, aka go against God, you have to will it. So if bad things happen because of evil, you can't be made to be evil by someone else if you don't choose it. So the only thing you can be punished for morally are the things you choose. This is Augustine's conclusion. So it's all about what you will for what the morals include. And somebody says, how is this different from Mencius's point of view, for example? Well, Mencius and Confucius would both agree that what you will is more important than the end result. So like the horrible example of, like, if you get raped in a sack, right? That's a horrible example, but if that happens, you can't be morally judged for the thing you didn't will. That would be the answer for St. Augustine. But I think Confucius and Mencius would probably also say that. The only difference is, though, I don't know how they would say it kind of like messes up your five relationship responsibilities. It's more complicated in that ethical system. So it'd probably be a little bit more convoluted. But there is that connection there where will is most important for if something's ethical or not. All right, any other questions before we jump into more of this? Take a sip from my tea, and let's get some water. And I don't see any more questions, so let's keep going. Okay. So how does this then turn into a historical theory? And I've heard it said that St. Augustine basically made what is called Christian anthropology. That means, like, how does a Christian look at kind of anthropology of humanity? Like, how do Christians explain, like, why things happen? All right. So part of this story of kind of protecting the Christianity in the church, he had to explain why the fall wasn't Christians' fault. Well, how did he do that? Well, he shows historical examples, basically, where Rome did well and badly under pagan gods. And he gives lots of historical examples. I can give you the parts of the book if you want to read, but trust my paraphrase. And he basically concludes it's not related to Christ or Christians. Why not? Well, there's basically no correlation of success and which gods they were following. It's much more like historical factors. He even goes into parts where, for example, certain, like very pious Romans would get really bad results. So like the amount you were loyal to a Roman god didn't correlate to your success at all before Christianity existed. So he's like, why would that happen after Christianity existed? That doesn't make any sense. And again, it's a good logical argument. You might not have to accept his conclusion, which is, therefore Christianity is better, but you can't blame pre-Christian failures on Christianity, right? That wouldn't make any sense. And then he makes another great point, that God did not teach morals. The pre-Christian pagan gods in Rome were not moral gods. It was more like you bribed a god, as we talked about before, like you bribed a god to not punish you. You didn't really get like morals from the gods. Now, a little bit later we'll get into it, there were moral gods. The problem was they were basically ignored. So it kind of makes his point. So like we'll talk about it later, there was a god literally called Virtue, but like she had like the smallest temple you've ever seen, and it was like a joke temple. So he has some points here. All right. Now, this is another point he makes to kind of protect the Christian perspective, but it's not a bad point. The gods were unable to save Rome, even during most pious times. So, when the Romans were very pious, and again, they wrote, right? The Romans were very literate, and Augustine's a Roman speaking Latin, right? So he is in the civilization. So he's well educated, so he has access to the history. The gods showed no efficacy to save Rome, even when there was pious times. So it didn't, like, their success or failure was uncorrelated to their gods. That's basically the argument he makes. So there's no correlation between faith in their original gods and success. It's almost completely uncorrelated in St. Augustine's view. And we'll talk about what he thinks is the cause for success later. But again, this is him defending it, and again, this is the first third or half of the book. So I am paraphrasing extremely. I think it took me 4 months to read the first half of this book. So, to be fair to me, though, it's a dense 1,100 pages. So, all right. Now, getting into, okay, if that's not what made Rome successful, then what did? Well, he starts getting into, there has to be, if it's not the gods, right, and you can't, so if it's not the old gods, then what made Rome successful? Well, he gets into principles, broad principles. Like, for example, he makes a point here that and this is going to sound kind of like Plato, kingdoms need justice. Otherwise, they're just criminals. This is a very interesting little mini section I almost missed the first time I read it. But he pointed out that, like, basically there's two kinds of kingdoms, right? There's just kingdoms where, like, they try to enforce the rules, and there's kingdoms that are just bandit kingdoms, where, like, people keep slowly working with a bandit lord, and then he takes over more cities, then he becomes a king accidentally. But that doesn't mean he's not a criminal, right? There is some justice above just what's mine. And again, this shows a bit of his Platonic training, which he openly owns later. The idea that there's justice above, as we talked about Plato's Republic, right? There's justice above the physical reality. So kingdoms need justice. Otherwise, they're just criminals ruling you. And the libertarians here probably love this point. So he's implying, right? And we'll get to the explicit, but implicitly, he's already kind of pointing towards Rome was successful because they had justice, not because of their gods. So there's these kind of traits in reality. And he points this out too. It seems a little random, but his book can be a little random. The medievals and the ancients wrote very interestingly. The god system in the ancient Greek, in his time, contemporary pagan Rome, it doesn't make sense. It's inexplicable for the benefits. Why? Well, they made basically Jupiter the key god, but he didn't do anything for them. He's like, why wouldn't you make your key gods the most logical gods? Like, for example, the Romans won a lot. Why wouldn't your key god be Victory? If you know anybody named Victoria, right? They're literally named after the Roman god of victory. That's a god, right? She is the god of victory. But she had a little dinky temple. Nobody ever followed her. Same thing with virtue and faith, right? These are demonstrably good things. But as gods, the Romans didn't worship them. And he's like, that doesn't make any sense, right? And they're the things giving you your benefits. Like, you're literally getting victory, and you have virtue and do well, and you have faith and do well. Why wouldn't you worship these things? And he points out, therefore, the efficacy of their gods obviously aren't very, effective. Now, I point this one out here. Why did I put it here? I just changed the slides. I have to decide why I wanted to put this here. Oh yeah, sorry, I'll make one more point here. I'm reading my notes on the side. The point he makes here too is you should, if you're going to pick pagan gods to worship, why wouldn't you choose virtues like felicity, prudence, justice, fortitude, temperance, right? Over Jupiter. Like Jupiter, he's the head god, but he doesn't really do anything empirically that is as good as virtues. Like, shouldn't we encourage virtues? And they're just like, nah, it's fine. We didn't pick those. So again, it's his critique of the Roman system. Now, we already talked a little bit about free will in my introduction slide, and he spends a lot of this book coming back to this topic. So right in the middle of this talk about the Roman gods, he talks about the difference between free will and foreknowledge compared to faith. Or fate, sorry. So we kind of don't use fate the correct way that fate used to mean in the Roman times, and pretty much until modern times. When you said, like, what's your fate? Fate literally meant in the Western conception, like, what stars are you born under, and how will those stars determine your life? And he actually uses, he if you read his confessions, his autobiography basically, for a time he was into astrology, but he realized it had no correlation to reality. So when he's saying foreknowledge isn't fate, foreknowledge is predestination. Remember, where, like, if there's a universal being, how could it know everything? And he's arguing with a Greek thinker called Cicero about it, and he's basically able to show that, like, if there is a God and he knows everything, then he has to have foreknowledge, but it's not fate. And then he talks about this interplay between free will and a creature that could know everything. Does this make sense? So it's a hard, complicated interplay, but he basically concludes that they can both exist at the same time, but because of our limitations, we might not necessarily understand how they work exactly. But it doesn't go against the traits of, like, say, the Christian God to say you could have free will and that God could know what you're going to choose. Basically, Christians believe he made all the rules under the system and made all the people in the system. So, of course, he would know how it works. It'd be like thinking like a programmer wouldn't know how his game, like, what were the choices in the game he made. That would be a comparison. So, all right. Getting back on topic, right? How do Romans have historical success? For St. Augustine, he basically concludes that the Roman system of honor and basically all successful temporal empires have at least an echo of heavenly virtues. Now, what do we mean by this? Well, basically, Roman success didn't come from their gods, he concludes after 400 pages. Let me see. Only 200 pages he concludes this. I'm checking my notes right now. So Rome didn't do well because of their pagan gods, which he basically proves, and by prove I mean he basically makes a historical argument for there's no correlation between success and their devotion to their gods. So it has to be something else. So then he starts digging into virtue. He basically proves the Roman system of honor leads to their success. And what was the moral... He basically has this quote here, the moral character of the Romans... and they had this basic theory that character was bigger than destiny, aka individual strong actors could do more. So there's a great quote here to describe the Roman character in the best periods of their empire. Quote, greed for praise and a passion for glory. So Romans had this real desire for non-physical goods. And he makes another comment here. Basically, Rome was very successful until they got moral corruption from wealth. And there's a quote here I couldn't skip. It's too good. It's 200 years later, it's still a good quote. And it's from Cato, who was a contemporary of Caesar. I'm going to block quote this because it's good enough. Do not imagine that it was by force of arms that our ancestors made a great nation out of a small community. If that were true, we should today have a far more glorious nation. In allies, in our own citizens, in armaments, in horses. We have greater resources than they enjoyed. But it was other causes that made them great. Causes that with us have ceased to exist. Energy in our own land. A rule of justice outside our borders. Informing policy. A mind that is free because... not at the mercy of criminal passions. Instead of these, we have self-indulgence and greed, public poverty, and private opulence. We praise riches. We pursue a course of sloth. No distinction is made between good men and bad. The intrigues of ambition win the prizes due to merit. No wonder, when each of you thinks only of his own private interest. When at home you are slaves to your appetites, and to money and influences in your public life. The consequence is that an attack is being launched on the Republic left without defenses. And that's Cato, not St. Augustine, but he quotes him verbatim. It's this idea, even the Roman side, that basically focusing on non-physical things led to their success. And then once they started focusing on money and power, they basically became degenerate. So, but what is the kind of explanation here? Well, for St. Augustine, he thinks that all successful temporal, so empires now, they get their success from an echo of heavenly virtues. Now, if you're non-Christian, you're like, what do you mean by heavenly virtues? St. Augustine would be, any virtue that focuses on non-physical goods is better than physical goods. So, for example, going after glory and what is glory? I love this definition. Glory is the judgment of men when they think well of others. So glory is just the opinion of other men, right? So glory and honor, right, kind of the history of glory, is a non-physical good. And Augustine basically argues non-physical goods demonstrably lead to better historical effects than focusing just on material goods like wealth and your appetites. So Rome was successful, and Cato, based the quote I just read, right? Okay, I'll repeat it. So let me finish this explanation, though. Cato also said this: Rome was most successful when it focused on non-physical goods. So honor, glory, the future, progeny, like your people who come after you. So you focus on, truth or justice, non-physical goods. So when you focus on non-physical goods, empires have more success, and Augustine would say that's because they're an echo of heavenly virtues, or as a Platonic person would say, intelligible virtues. So it's basically you focus on things that are theoretical or non-physical instead of like, I did the good thing for stuff. It's like I led for honor. So even though honor is a thing people give you, it's not a physical good. So for Augustine, his name's Cato. He was let me get what was his last name? Do I have it here? 200. There's two Catos, so I gotta figure out which one it was. Where is Cato's full name? I don't have it. I think it's just Cato the Elder. So look, Cato. He's Cato the Roman. He's a contemporary of Julius Caesar, basically. So he's a statesman. So Cato says it, but St. Augustine agrees. But Cato wouldn't have said they're heavenly goods. He just would have said they're timeless goods. But it's still this idea that there's goods above just having stuff. Because having stuff eventually degrades people. Now, there's also a couple examples here of justice in government and war. Now, I know just war can sound weird, but they actually make a great point here. Rome, and Augustine makes it, Rome didn't expand because it was hungry for conquest necessarily. It actually, justice in war in this time was, basically, it's just to invade your enemy once they attack you and subjugate them. Why? Because they'll keep doing it. That's the point. And he basically pointed out, striving for glory and honor and power by just means and merit is why Rome was successful. Now let me restate this again. Basically, society rewarded people in the height of Rome and in their growth for glory and honor and power was given justly, right, by people who had showed they were good, like they had these non-physical goods, and because they actually had merit. Like if a reward, you're able to fight well and you treat people well and you follow the law, and you're fighting for more than just your own interest. So, yeah. And somebody asked a great question I'm going to answer here. Do you think that this applies to all places, not just Rome? Augustine would say, for sure, this applies to every empire. So the more an empire would focus on non-physical goods, the more success it would have. And Augustine would call those non-physical goods heavenly virtues. But even a non-Christian or a secularist, he would say the success is still one-to-one linear. Like, if you focus on non-physical goods, you just have more success as a kingdom, or as a country, or as a state, or as a person, right? So and again, So he thinks this is the system of reality. It's not specific for Rome. This is just, Rome is also successful for this reason, but any empire would be successful for this reason. And how does this tie back into his theology and his philosophy? The conclusion basically is this goal is to explain the effect of providence in history. So basically, he's saying that like God designed a system. St. Augustine's point is where if you focus on non-material goods or heavenly virtues, your empire will get success, even if it's not a Christian empire or a Jewish empire. It's just humans can intuit, right? So humans can figure out from reality these rules of reality. And for a Christian, those rules are providence. For like an empiricist or a utilitarian, you're just saying they're empirically seen from reality. But for St. Augustine, he would say yes, but who put those rules there? His answer would be God. Great. Any other questions before we keep going? So the shortest paraphrase I can give, Rome's success from their virtues, not from their gods. It just happens those virtues also are like Christian virtues too. But the Romans would also argue their virtues, they just might not have agreed that they were Christian ones. They might not have known what that was, actually, because it was before Christ. Alright, and let's check if I have a Discord question. Nope. Alright, gonna keep going. What's my time? I got time. Good. Alright, more pictures because they're awesome. And this is the part where we get into some comparative philosophy. So I have a nice picture of the University of Athens. This is not the original, by the way. It's a reproduction I found in Japan, and this is my picture. So, haha. Alright. So, he then gets into Plato and other natural theology. And this is one reason we do St. Augustine, and why he kind of naturally leads. We did Plato last, and we get this connection here. So this is very interesting. In his time, he points out there's actually 3 kinds of theology. I love this so much. So he spends a lot of time talking about natural theology, or Plato and other natural theology, but he talks about the kind of theology he doesn't like. He calls it fabulous theology and civil theology. Basically, in the old days, there was like theology of the state, which is civil theology, like gods that you have to follow because they're from the government. Fabulous theology is just like entertainment theology. And he's like, natural theology is the only real one. And if you don't know what natural theology is, it's the only one we're going to focus on. It's what could you intuit about God or the nature of God from natural science, right? So from looking at reality and using logic, what could we figure out about God? And he has a whole section where he gets into Plato and other natural theology, and he basically claims that Plato got closest to the Christian truth on God. Plato almost intuitively, he got like 80% of the way to a Christian theology, just in his followers who were called Platonists. Him and follow-up Platonists almost got to like a Christian conception of God. And this is one reason we still have a lot of Plato and Aristotle, is Plato and Aristotle actually were absorbed into the Christian canon, because a vast majority of early Christians actually knew Plato and Aristotle, and they had some good points, right? They were the science of their time, and they got absorbed into the church. Now, the reason he does this too is first he was arguing the history, now he's arguing the philosophy. And he points out too that not only did they get similar on theology, and how similar did they get? Let me find this. The paraphrase he uses here is, how close did he get to the Christian truth? Well, they understood true God as the author of the universe, the source of the light of truth, and the bestower of happiness. So the Platonists and the Christians agree on those 3 things, right? There is a God who is the origin of truth and the light of the universe, and like the source of truth and giver of happiness. So from that, there's basically reality that we can get to. Now, what is that reality? Well, there's a development of a strong moral philosophy, and we already talked about this. What was it? Well, it was eudaimonia. If you remember, we talked about the well-being, right? So it's this idea that there is a well-being here that is a non-physical goods. Again, it's going back to that previous slide. So well-being is when you focus on like intelligible reality, non-physical reality. So the strong moral philosophy of the ancient Greeks was actually absorbed into Christianity. And this is the idea, again, it's going to sound a little bit like Confucius and Mencius, where good is the end of itself. Now, what were we missing in this system? Basically, the Platonists were still polytheistic, and they thought there was a connection of God through demons, to quote St. Augustine's perspective. Polytheistic means they thought there was multiple gods, but there was a supreme God, and then lots of sub-gods, and then they called them like air spirits. So there's a bunch of levels, and St. Augustine's like, obviously that's wrong, from Christian perspective anyway. And then the polytheism he had to reject as well. And he just called them all demons. So anyway, though, a couple other challenges that are interesting to know exists. We have Stoics and Epicureans. What you have to know about them, we're not going to be on a test or anything, but they're interesting. Epicureans thought that God exists. They're not Christians. They're ancient Greeks and Romans. But they thought that God exists, but he's so far away and doesn't care about us that the only purpose of life is to focus on like having a comfortable, nice life with pleasures. Sounds familiar. And then Stoics are the opposite. They believe in a non-physical reality, but they think there's, how can I say it? They thought you should only focus on what you can control in your mind, and you're only morally responsible for what you can do. So Stoics were very big on like not the opposite kind of Epicureans, where they didn't really care about pleasures and happiness. They instead cared about like self-discipline and only worrying about what the things you can control and self-cultivation and working on yourself as like an autonomous individual. Both of these are challenges in different ways. Epicureans are challenged because they basically say God doesn't care, and Stoics are kind of a challenge because they just say the only thing that matters is what is in your mind and not other people. But interesting enough, especially the Stoics, Christians actually absorbed Stoic theology, especially for meditative practices. But anyway, well, that's not here nor there. Now, this is talking about comparative philosophy. So, okay, he says all of these guys are wrong. Then the question then comes, if you say a non-Christian is reading this book 1,600 years ago, it's a long time ago, and they ask, so where does the authority of the church come from? Like, what claim to truth could this 4th century Christian have? Well, St. Augustine had a pretty easy answer. He said, it comes from miracles, aka the miracles of Jesus and of God and of all the saints, is the proof why you should be a Christian and why the church has authority. Now, interestingly enough, he actually ties this to other pagan gods. Now, let me explain. He asks a great question, and I don't think there's even a good modern counter. Why would anyone believe in religion without power? Now, before you just scoff and do a modern snarky answer, think about this for a second. Why would anyone in the ancient times, because evolutionarily, if you're an evolutionist, they're not any different from us in any meaningful sense. We have the same cognitive abilities, or lack of. But either way, why would they follow gods that didn't do anything? And this is St. Augustine's point for Christians and the pagans. And he makes a great point in his time. He just say, the historical record literally shows pagans doing things. And actually, in his time period, he's like, in my life, in my town, there's literally Christian miracles and other miracles. So he makes a point, why would anybody believe in a religion without power? And I've made the joke in class before, I don't remember if I made it in this class, but like imagine it's 2,000 years ago and you're a ship captain. And tradition is, you like have to sacrifice a goat to Poseidon. He's the sea god. And if you don't sacrifice a goat, Poseidon will be angry, okay? Now, you might think, like, ha, Poseidon is fake. But why wouldn't a ship captain think that? Just intellectually entertain this for a second, okay? And what if he thought that? He's like, okay, I'm going to do an experiment. Because, they can think scientifically, too. I'm going to send 50 ships when I don't sacrifice, and 50 ships when I sacrifice. What if, like, the 50 ships when he sacrificed, none of them sank? And then, like, the first ship he sent out without a sacrifice got, like, a hole punched in it and sank immediately, right? So it's good to think that wouldn't they have tried that too? And St. Augustine makes that point as well. And basically, this is an interesting point here that he makes. And actually, he doesn't make it. A pagan historian named Varro makes it. What's the difference between superstition and religion? One is respect, and one is fear. So basically, superstition is when you have fear of a spiritual force. Respect, it's a religion. This is an interesting difference. But what do they both agree on? That there is some effect of quote-unquote miraculous reality. So non-physical reality can affect physical reality. So this is basically the warrant. If you asked, why should you believe Christianity instead of these other ones? This is what St. Augustine would answer. Now, we're in the modern times, so you're supposed to be skeptical, but before you're skeptical, my only point would be to make, are 99.9% of humans wrong and we're super special, or are we missing something? It's a good question to entertain. I'm going to leave it up to you guys, but Augustine would say it's demonstrable. And actually, I didn't put it on here, but Augustine has a whole chapter of the book where he talks about where he originally thought miracles were bubkis, because he was a rhetoric teacher. So he's like, I don't believe it. And actually, he went from being miracles don't happen to maybe the Christian miracle happened. By the time he died, he's like, no, miracles happen all the time. So even Augustine, probably one of the smartest men who ever lived, kind of changed his mind. So it's an interesting thing to keep in mind. Any questions that aren't, but what about sacrifice? Yes, the ancient world, you definitely sacrificed animals. Christians stopped doing it, but a lot of people did it up until recently. So, yeah, it's pretty interesting. Yes, there's the idea that you have to pacify the spirits, kind of. And that's not a dead idea. It's actually still decently alive. Alright, I'm not seeing any questions. Oop. No, Amazon Music, don't open, you're going to lag. Oh, crap. Okay, there we go. Alright, so yes, you don't have to sacrifice animals, vegans, you're fine. In the ancient world, though, vegans, you would have had to, except for a couple sects that we'll talk about later. And I say sects, not sex, like, yeah, the other one. Not fornication. Okay, so if there's no questions, let's keep going. How much time we got? 15 minutes, perfect. Okay, let's get a little bit into his theology then. So we kind of got his history a bit, and we're going to come back to it actually, because after his theology, there's kind of like a whole package he constructs, which is the City of God. Then we have his comparative philosophy, and now we have his theology. So what's the structure of, like, God's reality, basically, in an Augustinian sense? First, he points out that true knowledge, and the idea of the Trinity, that was the idea where God is three aspects. These are things you could only know direct revelation from God, and you can't know it any other way. So why would he point this out? Because he basically said the Platonists, we mentioned on the last slide, did as good as they could. And these things they couldn't have known except for revelatory knowledge. AKA, the divine would have to tell you, like, oh yeah, by the way, I'm three parts, and by the way, here's my true knowledge. So some things aren't obvious from physical reality. This is, Augustine concedes this early. Okay. Now this is where we're going to get into some interesting terminology. All sin is an act of will against nature. Now, what's the difference between sin and evil? Depends on who you ask, but Augustine's answer would be something like, sin is going against God's law. But evil's a little bit different. I'll explain that, though. But so, all sin, so going against the will of God, is an act of will against nature. Now, we live in a time when nature means something different than what Augustine means. When St. Augustine says nature, he is using a Christian anthropology. What that means is he means nature is the created perfect nature that God made all humans in. So again, for a Christian, they actually have to believe if God is God and God is perfect, he can make us perfect. That's a Christian theology, the worldview, basically. So all sin is an act of will against nature, but nature isn't what we think of in the 21st century naturally as like a scientific nature. It's more like the perfect nature that God created. So all sin is an act against nature that God made. So you're acting against the rules God made in the system, basically. And then what's evil? Because sin and evil aren't exactly the same thing. Sin is breaking God's law. Evil, for St. Augustine, is a privation of the good. This is a direct quote. Now, I'm going to show you a little trick that we've done once, but I want to do it one more time. Let me find, where is my, yes. My favorite dictionary. If any words I use here are hard, please see, let me give it a second to show up, Webster's Dictionary 1828. It has all these old words for you to find. So privation is the state of being deprived, particularly deprivation or absence is what is necessary for comfort. He endures his privations with wonderful fortitude. And then here we go. So there's the, for what is, here we go. Absence in general, or darkness, is a privation of light. An act in the mind in separating a thing from something appendant. So it's this idea that is a lack of something. That's what privation means. So evil is the privation of the good. That's all evil is in an Augustinian sense. Now, what does that mean? Well, go away. Goodbye. And wrong button. Here we go. Yeah. So, for an Augustinian sense, right, this means if God is good and God made everything, this is kind of his theology, and God is all-powerful and all-knowing and everything, and God made humans in good nature, evil then is lacking the good God gave. Now, there's a couple other logical steps that are missing here that help explain kind of his theory. For example, evil cannot exist without the good. Evil is just nothing in an Augustinian point of view. So, good is necessary for evil to exist, and all evil is, in that sense, in a St. Augustine sensibility, is getting away from the good. Now, what does that mean? Well, God is the ultimate good in a Christian / Augustinian / Platonic sense. So, evil is getting away from good. So, sin in general is evil because it's a will against good, which is against God, which gets you further away. But it's not always necessarily. But I'm not going to get into the fine tuning here. There's some fights we could have about that, and I am not in the mood. Now, Augustine also has some very interesting, we'll call it, he does Descartes better than Descartes. What I mean is, if you don't know Descartes, he was a philosopher in the 17th, 16th century, 15th century, who said, I think, therefore I am. St. Augustine did it before Descartes did, which is interesting. And he said, I exist, I know it, and I'm glad of it. So kind of his three pillars of, how do we even know we exist? Well, where is the origin of our thought? And for him, this is it. And somebody asked me a question, so if a person sins enough, they are deemed evil. Well, so in a St. Augustinian sense, this is a good question. He would say, the problem with sin is it gets you away from God, so therefore it's evil. So evil is just like distance from God, if that makes sense. Now, what it means is you're getting away from good things. That's all evil is for a Augustinian point of view. So, and it's degrees, right? So it's how far are you getting away from the good? That is what evil is. So if something's totally... something... Because St. Augustine, he's actually called the Doctor of Grace. We'll get into that a little bit later. Every Catholic saint who's a doctor, aka teacher, gets his own nickname. And St. Augustine's is the Doctor of Grace. He basically he believes in like the depravity of humanity, like we choose to be evil, and then the only way to not be evil really is to go towards God. So, but yeah, he would say if you sin enough, you are evil. Yes. Okay, now we start to get into where he bifurcates. What this means is, he then starts to separate. Okay, so we have that here's God, here's good, here's our nature, here's us going against our nature. So how do we live? Like, how does one live in these two standards, right? Like, if there's a way to live, let's say there's a good way and a bad way. How do we live that way? Well, he basically has some quotes here. Firstly, he says... Falsehood consists of not living in the way he was created. Man wants to be happy, so all sin is falsehood. And this is actually a paraphrase of a very long paragraph from his book. But the point here he makes is, not only is sin going against God, but sin is also falsehood. Because in the Christian Greek conception, God is also all origin of all truth, right? So if you get away from God, you get away from good, and you get away from nature, and you get away from truth. So, falsehood consists of not living in a way that you were created. So you were created good, but falsehood's getting away from it. But man still wants to be happy. So all sin is both falsehood and makes you unhappy. Oh. I'll leave that alone for now. I got a good question here. Someone says, so if evil is a spectrum and sin pushes the bar further down the line? Yes, that would be the answer. And for someone like St. Augustine, his theological answer of how do you get back towards the good, he would say that the best way is you need Jesus and God, and that gets you back to the good fastest. But for people who, let's say, like the pre-Christians, his answer would be back to the slide before, where he said the focus on non-physical goods are goods, so they move you closer towards God, even if you didn't know he was there. That would be kind of the answer. So now we start to get to separation of standards, right? So basically he's saying the standard of God is you know God exists, so you know truth, so you can be happy, and you can be away from sin. And the standard of man tends to be falsehood, which is less good, which means you can't be as happy. Somebody says, can I repeat that? Sure. Yes, I will repeat it really quick. So, for St. Augustine, if remember we talked about how he thought Rome was successful. He thought Rome was successful because it followed non-physical and, as he said, heavenly virtues. So, the idea is one could get closer to good by following virtues, but because humans are flawed, we can't get the whole way. So that's why you need religion and salvation and Christ and all of that. But the idea is focusing on good naturally, using his definition of nature, naturally would get you closer to God. And this is why, for example, how could Plato be 80% right in St. Augustine's view? Because he focused on the good, right? He tried to find non-physical goods and understand kind of reality. And he got close to God. Not enough for a Christian point of view, but close enough. Even in the book, I was rereading it yesterday, and there's a quote from St. Augustine where he even said something like, had Plato been born after Christ, he definitely would have been a Christian. Because this idea that we can intuit correct answers from reality, and then they lead us towards the good, which eventually would lead us towards God. That's Augustine's theory, anyway. All right. Now, this is where it's a theological point, but I'll make the point as well as I can. Talking about will again, this is interesting. There's a lot of terminology here about, okay, but if we have will, but then what if God gives us rules? Wouldn't following all of God's rules make us less free? Augustine has a whole section, actually, where he argues. St. Augustine says there's more freedom with God. What he means is because if this is true, right? If there's a God and he made humans good in nature and all nature good, and being good in true is being closer to God, then the closer you are to God, the more truth you have, not falsehood, and you're living the way you were meant to be created, which means you're happy. Because you're not in falsehood, right? You're not living in an incorrect way. You're living in the way you were meant to act. So therefore, you're more free because you're living in a more true way, kind of matching the nature of how you were created. And this is almost like the Greek idea of like techna, of you're not just living good, but living good has a moral aspect. And then the Christians add that layer that you're living good and has a moral aspect, and it gets you closer to God. That's kind of how the Christians add to it in a moral sense. Someone asks, so there's no way to reach salvation except through Jesus, despite getting as close as possible. So Augustine would say, again, the answer is you need grace. Now, if the best, the best non-Christian question I've heard is basically, what about people who exist in the timeline before Christ? That is a great counter question. St. Augustine actually answers that. He says, and we'll next class we'll talk about his time theory, because God exists outside of time, Jesus exists outside of time, so one could have access to Jesus before he existed in temporal reality. That's St. Augustine's answer. It's super elaborate, and I can give more on that, but that's such a good question. We're now out of time. Oh no, we can't get to the end of the slide. So we're a little bit behind, but we'll be okay. If there's any final questions, now is the time to ask me. And I will check both. Boop. I don't see any final questions. That was a really good question, though. Yes. But Augustine still thinks you need grace, but he does think it works forwards and backwards through time. All right. If there's no more questions, we'll finish theology. Let me see how far behind we are. I think we're only a half slide behind. We're doing pretty good. So, and then next time we're going to do how this works in practice. Like, how do we make a society out of it? How does it make ethics? And then we'll do his time theory next class. So if you haven't looked at the e-reserves, now is the time to go find the e-reserve and read I think it's 10 pages of the Confessions. Somebody says, when's the test again? I'll answer all that after the stream. But for those of you who are just watching the stream, thanks for hanging out. Next Thursday, we'll do part 3 of this. And it might spill a little bit into next week, I'm not going to lie. That may, in fact, happen. So if you want to see St. Augustine's time theory, please join us next time. Thank you all for joining us. Take it easy.